Welcome to Marquis Monday, a 6-month Lafayette 200 Bicentennial series featuring authors who have written books related to the Marquis de Lafayette. During our program this evening, we invite you to submit any questions you might have by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits. The young Frenchman who sailed across the Atlantic to America in 1777 to fight in the Revolutionary War saw his first military engagement at the Battle of Brandywine. Our author this evening is Bruce Mowday, an award-winning author and newspaper reporter who wrote about this military campaign. He has authored more than 25 books on sports, business, true crime, and history, including Lafayette at Brandywine, The Making of an American Hero, and Lafayette, America's Young Hero and Guest. Mr. Mowday has appeared on numerous television and radio shows and has served in leadership roles with the Chester County Historical Society, the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates, the Valley Forge Park Alliance, Chester County Conference and Visitors Bureau, as well as the American Friends of Lafayette 200 Bicentennial. Bruce, it is our honor to welcome you, my friend.
Kathleen, thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm just glad you didn't title this Monday Marquis Mowday. There's been too much alliteration for me. And thanks to everybody that showed up tonight for our Zoom presentation on Lafayette, who's really become a friend of mine over the last 2 years. I actually, when I was in Fayetteville, of course, named after Lafayette, I got this big scroll of him, and I usually take it when I give talks, and he's always over my right shoulder. I'd like to tell the audience a little bit about my journey and how I wrote the book and what's behind the book. It started out many years ago, and I was actually president of the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates. And I was really flabbergasted when I found out there was not a book written on the Battle of the Brandywine. And I decided that would be a great book to write, and was much needed. And it took a number of years of research and a trip to London to get the British Army side. And I worked with a local state publisher to get the book published. And in it, of course, I mentioned Lafayette. But he wasn't like a main focal point. And later on, after a number of years, I knew there was something about Lafayette that deserved more than I wrote about in my book. And when I do books, it's not so much I go out and I'm the one that selects the books. A lot of times the books select me. And I think in a way, this is what happened. During that awful period of COVID is when I did a lot of research, because I could do it online on the Lafayette at Brandywine. But for a long time, there was just this word keep going over and over my mind, and the word was Lafayette. It's a great name. It's kind of literary, Lafayette. And I started to do some research and looking to see what I had missed in the original book. And it became clear that his rise to an American hero began on September the 11th, 1777 at Brandywine. Because if you look early in that morning, very few people knew who he was. He had been on Washington's staff for a few weeks. It wasn't unusual to have a European officer on Washington's staff. He didn't command any troops. He'd never been in battle. So you had this really obscure European officer serving Washington in the morning. And by the end of the day, he was well on his way to becoming an American hero and a hero back in France. When he came to America, he was only 19 years old. He defied his king. He defied his father-in-law. He forgot to tell his wife he was leaving. And the king tried to stop him before he made his way to America. I'll tell a little bit about the background of the story. But one of the things I learned doing all this research was he stood for his ideals all the way through his life. Even when he put his own life in jeopardy, his wife's family became in jeopardy during the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, he was a prisoner in Austria for a number of years, but he wouldn't give up his ideals. He wouldn't go back on what he believed. And really, I think that makes him worthy of our remembering him today, besides what he did to help us win our freedom. And when I give a talk, a lot of people say, we really need another Lafayette today to help us. And I would agree. So the more I got into him doing the research and figuring out that indeed Brandywine was the focal point when he was really started his rise, I thought a book was needed. And I called and talked with several people at the American Friends of Lafayette. I believe Alan Hoffman gave one of the presentations and might have been the kickoff. Alan's a great guy, great historian. I'm sure he told you about his taking Lafayette's secretary book of his trip to the U.S. as America's guest and translated from French to English. And Alan very nicely allowed me to use the back part or some of his information for my book. And the whole American Friends were just excellent. Every time I came to a section that didn't quite make sense, or I couldn't tell, or I had conflicting information, all I had to do was to call the American Friends, and they had experts on every aspect of Lafayette's life, and they answered my questions. It was amazing research tool for me. I was also honored after the draft manuscript was written. Chuck Schwam, who is one of the officers of the American Friends and also heading up the bicentennial celebration of Lafayette's return, he looked at it and he did this great foreword to the book, which I was very pleased with. So my book was not something that was just kind of written off. It was actually a couple decades in the making and 3 or 4 years of a lot of research of a lot of different places. They clued me in early on to take a look at Lafayette memoirs, which I did. And there's some variations of the memoirs on the internet, but they steered me to the one that was authentic that I used. And I loved using his memoir because it gave an insight into his personality and also what he thought about certain situations. And that's what I tried to do with my book. My book tells the story. I've been told I'm more of a storyteller, or much of a storyteller, as I am a author and a historian. And I think that's training from my being a newspaper reporter, that you have to tell the story. You got to get it to your readers and they have to understand it. And I had this great subject of Lafayette to make sure the readers knew and kind of understood. I looked at after my research was done and how I was going to construct it. And it's not a biography, because as I tell people, to do a really honest biography of Lafayette, it'd probably have to be about 4 volumes of 2,000 pages each. He was involved in so much and so much writing, and he knew so many people. And of course, he was known as almost the son of George Washington. And he really did have a father and son relationship, just a great person. But I started out and I did a lot of research. I had already had research on Brandywine, and I had what Lafayette said he did here, and I had some more information on Washington and started pulling it together. And I knew at that point, and from talking to people about Lafayette, and that he was not as well known as he should be. So I expanded the book to not only do Brandywine, but also his service to the United States and helping to win our freedom, and also went into what happened to him a little bit anyway in the French Revolution. I'm not any kind of an expert on the French Revolution. It's really convoluted and awful period of France's history, but it needed to be talked about in the book. I ended up, of course, with with him being America's guest. President Monroe, who he fought with and knew with from the American Revolution, was president at the time. He knew that we had not done enough to honor Lafayette for his great service, and he also had a political ideal behind it. We were approaching our 50th anniversary as a nation, and he wanted somebody to be there to kind of to be the cheerleader and that the citizens could rally behind. And who better than Lafayette? And in 1824, in August, Lafayette landed in New York City to thousands and thousands of people, and I'm sure Alan told you a little bit about it, that it's been recreated as part of the Lafayette celebration. I was there in New York City and got to ride in the boat with Lafayette when he landed in Manhattan and took part in the parade. And it was really a festive 3 days. The French government helped us, and the French consulate had a champagne reception for us, and I got to sign books at the New York Armory, the old Armory building, underneath the portrait of Lafayette. I don't know how I had the honored seat, but I did get to do that. But he just kind of you really need to look at the reception he got for 13 straight months, and it was almost daily, not quite, but it was almost daily, where he was shown parts of our society, and there were dinners and there were parades and speeches and everything. And this went on for 13 months. I don't think anybody today could be, would be worthy of being honored for 13 months, but that's indeed what Lafayette was. And people loved him. They showed up in bad weather, good weather, by the thousands to have a chance to see him and to talk to him. A very personal man all the way through his life. He greeted the crowds, and he remembered people. He remembered those who fought with him during the American Revolution, and he would always greet them. Very, very personal guy. After my book came out, I was in Yorktown. Of course, Lafayette was very much responsible and had played a big part for the Cornwallis surrender on October 19th, 1781. And he was there. And after the book came out, I attended the event, the Yorktown celebration. American Friends of Lafayette always has a contingent there. And I gave a talk. It was one of my first talks on the book to the American Friends. It was a great evening. And we stayed at a bed and breakfast as we usually do, the same one. And the next day at breakfast, the proprietor was sitting there and joining in. We're having a talk about Lafayette and everything, and he had a great question. He said, "What really impressed me?" He asked me what impressed me during all my research of Lafayette, and what really stands out. And I thought about it for a minute, and actually, I thought back to an incident that Alan wrote about in the secretary's book about the 13-month tour here of Lafayette. And actually, the secretary said this was Lafayette's favorite moment of the whole 13 months. And this tells a lot about Lafayette, and also a lot about how he was revered here in the United States during that time. And it was not a formal reception. It was not a parade. It wasn't, a politician giving a speech. But he was in Virginia coming through, and his carriage had a little bit of an issue. and he needed some repairs. So it's unscheduled, and he stopped. And during that stop, there was a tavern owner, of course, recognized him and went over and invited him in and asked a favor. He said, General, could you spare a minute and just say hello to my wife and my son? And of course, Lafayette did. Like I said, he was very personable, and just, you can see him doing that. And at the end of that meeting, and before he left, the innkeeper's son put his hand on Lafayette's shoulder and said, thank you for winning our freedom, thank you for winning my parents' freedom, thank you for everything you've done, for our country. And this was just such a moving point. And I think the young boy's words kind of really expressed exactly what the rest of the country had been doing for 13 months, thanking him for what he did. Lafayette, um, like I said, early on, he came to America, but his early life, his father was killed when he was 2 years old in a fight the French had with the English in the 7 Years' War, and I think that was a great part of why Lafayette really had a grudge against the British his whole life. Both his mother and father's family were well off, and before long, when he was a youngster, his mother also died, which left him to be one of the richest people in France. And he very well could have, and I'm sure many people would have. He would not have ventured to a land that he didn't understand the language, and they were fighting for something called freedom and independence. And of course, in France and in Europe, you did what the king told. You didn't have that individual freedom. So it was a foreign concept with him, but he still rallied around to come over and to help us. And for being a youngster, it's almost unimaginable that he knew what should be done, and he very much believed in equality for all. Didn't matter if you're a man or a woman or black or white. It just didn't matter. Everybody was equal, and lesson we should all learn today. While he was in Paris. His mother died, as I said. He could have very easily just stayed in the king's court where he was welcome. But he wanted to continue the military career, and he wanted to be an officer. And he actually, the one skill he lacked was dancing. He apparently stepped on the queen's toes during one dance and was not forgiven for that. But at one point, he was a musketeer and met the king every day to get orders there in Paris. His father-in-law suggested, after he married very young, it's kind of interesting that his wife did not know she was engaged to him for a couple years, and his mother-in-law wanted to make sure he was a suitable catch for her daughter before they agreed to the arranged marriage. The arranged marriages, that's what happened way back then, and it was lucky, I think, for Lafayette and Adrienne, his wife, that this was really a good match, and you could tell they were partners in love, and just a strong bond between them their whole lives, to the point that when Lafayette was in prison, Adrienne and daughters went to the prison and nursed Lafayette back to health. He almost died in that prison cell. So you had this young man who's now married, and he has a young daughter, and he becomes an officer in the French army. And you got to remember, as an officer then, you didn't get it on merit. You got it because you had enough money to pay for the position, and that indeed is what Lafayette did, and he became an officer. And during one of his postings, his commanding officer took a great liking to him, and he introduced him to the Masons. Very, very important, because who was Masons when he got to the United States? It was Washington, Jefferson, Ben Franklin, a lot of the movers and shakers were all Masons, and this actually gave him an entree that he did use and support. In August of 75, he was at a dinner invited by his commanding general, and there was a special guest. And this was after the 7 Years' War was concluded. And the guest was the brother of the King of England. And he was talking about these colonists that wouldn't listen to his brother and how dare they not take his orders. And, you know, I have a vision that Lafayette was sitting at a table and he just kind of shaking his head. Yeah, it sounds good to me. I'm going to help out. And that started his quest to become over. He enlisted some of his friends to come with him. The king, even though the king supported us and wanted us to beat England, they were not strong enough, and it just, you know, they didn't have the money to take on England at that time themselves. And pretty much the king told Lafayette and every other noble connected with the king to just stay put. Don't go and be a obvious supporter, because they were afraid that England would declare war on France. Lafayette was not to be deterred at all, and at 19, he set out with some of his fellow officers to come to the United States and help. The king and his father-in-law both tried to stop him. The king sent some of his troops, but he escaped to Spain. And of course, he needed transportation in the United States, and being one of the richest people, what did he do? He bought his own ship to get to the United States. And indeed, he made it over. He put his time on that ship to good use. He studied English. He studied military tactics, because by this point, he had a commission to be an officer in George Washington's army. And he figured if he was an officer, he should know what he was doing. So he studied that. And he wrote this great letter back to his wife. And as I mentioned earlier, he forgot, or he didn't forget, he just didn't tell her that he was leaving. And I love the old letters and doing the historical research. I don't quote long passages usually, because sometimes the language then is a little stilted and you got to stop and you go back and it stops the flow. But I did quote a bit of this letter, and it was very much a 19-year-old who made this decision, who's having second thoughts. And like every other line was, "You'll be proud of me, you still love me," but you could tell he was having this indecision. He made it to South Carolina, got off the ship. Luckily, where they landed, the land was owned by a Mason and a military officer in the American Army, and they treated him well, and he made his way to Philadelphia with his commission and presented it to the Congress. And of course, the Congress said, "Go home. We don't want you." Actually, George Washington had had his fill of European officers who drained the coffers and didn't speak the language and couldn't raise troops and disrupted his military campaign command. But Lafayette persisted, and Franklin came in and helped him out to get him a position in Washington. They reversed Washington, and by August of 1777, indeed, he was a member of George Washington's army. Didn't have a command, but he was on Washington's staff, and this was really when the friendship with Washington took place. He was a staunch supporter of Washington throughout his life. During the war, there were some American military officers who would really like to replace Washington, but Lafayette stood steadfast behind him. He did not get a command right away. He did follow Washington as they were watching the movements of General Howe's British, as they at first attempted to come up to the Delaware to attack Philadelphia, and then back out and up the Chesapeake and landing at the head of the Elk. There was a little council at the Hale Burn House in Delaware on Lafayette's 20th birthday. And they were talking about where to defend Philadelphia from this British invasion. And Congress told Washington, you must defend Philadelphia. You can't just let him walk and let the British walk in and capture our capital. And they figured out they would do it behind the Brandywine River. And Lafayette was there when all the defenses were put up. And in his memoir, he talks about Washington. He talks about being with him and back of the Chad House and doing whatever he could to help. When it became obvious that the British had outflanked Washington, were up on Osborne Hill, where Ryland Run Country Club is, and he was about to be outflanked and probably have his army destroyed, that Washington needed all the help that he could. Washington ordered General Sullivan and his troops to swing around and meet the British. They were having trouble, and that's when Lafayette said, hey, I'm going to go up and help. Washington said, go ahead. And Lafayette took one of his, or several of his French aides, including a man named Jamet, and they rushed to Birmingham Hill. They found some American troops. They were trying to, under General Conway's actually supervision, and they were not doing well, getting in order. The British were coming up. Now you had this young general who very well could have, just stayed on his horse in the background and pointed out what they should do. And he had every right to do that, but he did not. He got down off of his horse. He got in front of those troops, faced the British fire, tried to get them in line, tried to do a bayonet charge. And that's when one of the British balls struck him in the left leg, and he suffered his wound and he spilled the blood for freedom. And that was the moment when everybody knew he was serious. It was just not another European officer padding his resume. He was a volunteer also, he didn't take any pay. Jamet saw that the blood was coming out of his boot and said, General, we got to get you to safety. They put him back on a horse, took him back to the tree line, which I think is back by a Wiley Road today. And he made his way to Chester that night, still trying to help steady the troops as the retreat went on after the loss. He made it to Chester. They took him into a house because he still needed some treatment. And the doctor was on his way, and they cleared off the kitchen table and they put Lafayette up on the table. And when his fellow officers from Washington staff came in to check on him, he quipped, gentlemen, I know you're hungry, but I'm not dinner. Remember, he's on the dinner table at that point. But that's really an insight into what a person he was. Like I said, he stood up, he was fearless. He would call out even friends when they were wrong. The one big argument he had with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson was over slavery. And he said, you need to get rid of it. It's not right. And Lafayette put his money where his mouth is, basically. And before the French Revolution, he purchased a couple plantations in West Indies and took the slaves and paid them and educated them and started them on the road to freedom. And there's just so many stories about Lafayette that you really can't do it in a half hour. You can't even do it in the book, as I did with the American Friends. The second book that I did, the Lafayette's Young American and Guest, was really from the bicentennial committee that I'm chairing in Chester County. And early on, we knew there was not a nonfiction book for students on Lafayette, and that's how this one has come about. And I think we've distributed over 1,300 copies at this point, and I want to thank Deborah and our DAR group, because the DARs, I bought a lot of them, and especially in some of the Midwest ones. And we sell it just for the cost of the printing, and they are distributing it to students, because we all need students and adults to know what Lafayette did for us, remember us, and honoring. I see I'm at my 7:30, Kathleen, so if you want to switch it over, go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Bruce. At this time, Mr. Mowday will be entertaining questions presented by DAR Region and Lafayette 200 Committee Person, Deb Thompson. Debbie?
Good evening, everybody. We do
Hi,
have
Deb.
some questions for you tonight, Bruce.
Okay.
Robert asked, what was his relationship with other French officers, specifically Rochambeau, and I'm probably going to murder this one to death,
Yeah, that's right.
Chastelux?
That sounds good to me.
Okay. Did they accept him begrudgingly despite his lack of military experience? And what was his relationship with Washington?
By the time the French officers came over to help us, and they didn't come over right away, he was becoming a hero in France. So I'm sure he was looked at, because of the lack of military training, not like a grizzled veteran. But I think they did accept him. And Washington also used Lafayette when there was an issue with the integration of the American and the French forces. And early on, there was a lot of problems, and Washington would get Lafayette and send him to smooth out everything. So there was a good relationship with them, I think, and it wasn't totally smooth, and it wasn't totally smooth with American officers. We had a few disagreements with the American officers, as you can imagine, but he was good for us.
Okay. Marietta asked, I can understand your interest in the Battle of the Brandywine, but I wonder if there were any other battles or part of Lafayette's military career that stand out to you similarly.
It's yes, the big one, of course, is the Virginia campaign that led to the Yorktown and the surrender, when Washington sent Lafayette to Virginia to help out, because we were getting beaten really bad down in Virginia. He didn't have many troops. Washington told him, said, look, don't take on Cornwallis head on, because he's got a superior professional army. You need to just kind of snipe at him and kind of do what we did early on in New England. And Lafayette went down there and he did exactly what he told. He really had Cornwallis using up troops and energy and supplies to the point that Cornwallis had to get supplied from New York City, and he retreated back towards the coast to be picked up by the British Navy. And Lafayette, put the sound out and told Washington, get down here with the French army and us, and get the get the French Navy up from the West Indies, and we can capture him. And Washington said, don't you dare allow him to escape inland. And Lafayette did that. And he was there during the last battle of the Yorktown siege, and he actually wanted to run it himself, but Washington gave Hamilton, who was under Lafayette's command, to take one of the redoubts, and the French did the other. So he was very much leading the Virginia campaign that led to Yorktown. And a couple of the earlier campaigns, or when he was given responsibilities to troops after he recovered from his leg wound and before Valley Forge, kind of showed his maturity as he did gain experience. So I think he became a good officer, and again, just very good for us.
Okay. Robert is asking, I was particularly impressed with Lafayette's knowledge of the Oneida Indians and Black soldiers whom he knew during the war, during his U.S. tour. Can you comment on these episodes?
Yeah, really, Lafayette was such an astute politician, along with being an officer, and there was an aborted invasion of Canada, which is a long story, but some officers that wanted to, including, Gates and Conway, wanted to get Washington out of leadership, and they thought one way to discredit him was to discredit Lafayette. So they figured Lafayette was a Frenchman, and he'd jump at the chance to invade Canada and get it back for the French, and they were going to do it in the middle of winter. Lafayette had, he knew this was a fool's errand, and he let everybody know, and eventually it fell apart. But when he was in New York State, he became friends with the Indians up there in Oneida. Actually, during our New York celebration in August, we had a member of the Oneida tribe come in and gave a great talk about it. He became so entwined with them that they loved him, that indeed they gave him an Indian name, which I have it in the book. I forget which exactly it is, but you could tell that. And when he came back, he also, United helped him during some of the campaigns where he was a general, and that was a great lasting friendship that kind of showed what we should have done. For the slaves, of course, he helped a young slave from Virginia who was really a spy for us during Yorktown, and Lafayette helped him to gain a pension and really helped him along, and it took the name Lafayette. It's interesting also during his travels down south with the bicentennial that some of the slave owners would not allow anybody under his control to go anywhere near Lafayette, because Lafayette always preached freedom and anti-slavery. So he did keep this. He had some severe talks with Jefferson and Washington over slavery, and when you read the responses, they sort of agree with Lafayette, but then they never took action to free the slaves until after they died. So, yeah, he had a lot of, like I said, he was colorblind. Everybody, man, woman, didn't matter. We should be free and equal.
Okay. The next question, when he stepped on the Queen's foot while dancing, was that Marie Antoinette?
Yes, it was. And I think she kind of joked about it, but he really wanted to be out and be a military, and very much he could have stayed there, but that's not what he wanted to do, and I think we're all glad here that he did go out and pursue his career.
Okay. Robert is asking, although Lafayette was an abolitionist, did he regard the Black people as true equals? He seemed to be in favor of colonization, but did he feel that he could have a meal with them at the same table like John Brown did prior to the Civil War?
Yes, I saw no indication that there was any segregation at his meals or anything else. And during his bicentennial, when he came back as America's guest, he greeted the various slaves that he knew and interacted with them. And like I said, he actually bought a couple plantations, indeed, with the idea to educate them, pay them, and give their freedom. So I saw no indication of that.
Okay. As you were researching your book, was there anything that you discovered new about Lafayette that surprised you?
A lot of it was new to me because, like, a lot of other people, and I think a lot of other people today, and I think people in general, they don't know Lafayette and Lafayette's life. The whole French situation when he was put into prison, and his wife was on the list to be guillotined when Monroe, who's our future president, and Monroe's wife helped get her off the guillotine list, and some of her family were guillotined. It's just an awful part of history for Lafayette and Lafayette's family. And yeah, I didn't know that. I still don't know everything. And as I was delving into it, I thought, wow, just what an amazing person to come over, 19, 20 years old and have that vision and what he went through. And it's a little bit easier because you're one of the richest people in France, but he didn't have to do it. So the more I read about him, the more amazed I am. And I didn't know what to do. That's why I do the research and writing. It's new to me too, so I enjoyed doing it. So a lot of it was very much new to me.
Can you tell our viewers this evening how they can purchase your book?
Yes, both of them. I mean, if anybody wants signed copies, you can get the books by contacting me, and my email is mowday@mowday.com. That's my last name, Mowday @Mowday, MOWDAY.com. Amazon has them all, has the Lafayette Brandywine books. They'll need to contact me for the young hero book because I did it with the American Friends, and it's a fundraiser for the American Friends and for students. But you can get it through me, you can get them through Amazon, you can get it through Barricade Publishing, but it's probably easier through me or Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Actually, I was in Barnes and Noble, the Exton branch, just last weekend signing books.
Okay. We have another question that came in from Robert. He says, what were the circumstances during the French Revolution that resulted in him ending up in an Austrian prison?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. When Lafayette went back, of course, he wanted to have American style freedom for the Frenchmen. And he was a proponent of that, and he got caught in the middle. The king said, I'm not giving up any of my power. And the French people said, Lafayette is so associated with the king, we don't know if we can trust him. So he was trying to balancing act. At one point, he was the head of the militia, and was supposed to arrest the king, and he saved them at one point from being attacked at Versailles. And the rebels in France at one point wanted to arrest the king and the king's supporters, and he was out, and the king's supporters arrested him, and of course the Austrian king was related to the French king, so he ended up in the Austrian prison. It's very convoluted.
All right. For a closing message, what would you like adults and students to know about the Marquis?
That he is a worthwhile person to get to know, that he was a true believer in freedom, and that we owe a lot. We owe our independence to Lafayette. And I hope they all go and research it.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have tonight.
Sounds good.
Bruce, thanks so much for your fascinating presentation. It was so beautiful the way you provided such personal insight into Lafayette the man. So please know that tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be made available for later viewing on our YouTube channel, Lafayette 200 Marquis Mondays. We hope you have enjoyed this program this evening, and we invite you to attend our next Marquis Monday, which takes place on Monday, February 17th, with author Jeff Finnegan, who has written My Dear General, the extraordinary relationship between George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. Until then, bonsoir. Good night, everyone.
Good night.